As I watched him unload the bags, I kept thinking myself that I shouldn't have let him to carry my groceries. He was younger than me, but the way he looked at me, as if he already knew the thoughts racing through my head, made it impossible for me to pretend I didn't feel something dangerous. The muscles in his arms moved with every movement, and his shape was too alluring for me to ignore. In my heart, I knew Jorge since he was a child, my best friend's son, the boy I watched grow up over innumerable backyard cookouts, holiday dinners, and birthday celebrations. He had always been courteous, kind, and perhaps a little reserved, but now he was a man with broad shoulders, strong jaws, and eyes full of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It had been years since I'd really looked at him, and it suddenly occurred to me that I wasn't the only one looking. I had no idea you went shopping by yourself. As he took a bunch of lettuce out of a bag, Jorge turned to face me and spoke. His voice had altered too much from what I remembered, the kind of voice that got a lady to pay attention. I leaned on the counter and shrugged. Something about the way he said it and the way he looked at me made me feel hot, but I forced myself to ignore it, smiling and shaking my head. I prefer to take my time, and no one is hurrying me through the aisles. His lips were curled up, saying, I don't mind helping, you shouldn't be hauling all these bags inside yourself. I manage quite fine. He remained silent for a while, simply unloading the bags and moving about my kitchen as if he belonged there. It had been too long since a man had moved around my space in this way, touching things at ease in a way that was both familiar and unfamiliar, and I detested how much I enjoyed it. You don't have to stand there all the time. Desperate to diffuse the tension and give the impression that I wasn't observing his every move, I said, I don't mind. He looked up at me once more, knowing that I liked to be helpful, so I should have stopped it right there and pushed him out the door with a courteous thank you. But instead, I let him stay and let him lean in a little closer. When he handed me a bag of apples, his fingers brushing mine, he held my gaze, and I realized that he was playing a game to see how far I'd let him go. I was old enough to know better, but that didn't mean I wanted him to stop. It's been a long time since I've seen you, I said, forcing my voice to stay even though he agreed, watching me too closely. Mom says you've been busy. I swallowed life gets in the way. He nodded, but the way he looked at me gave me the impression that he didn't believe my excuse, and perhaps neither did I. I had kept my distance, sure, but it wasn't just life. It was also moments like this where I let my guard down and saw what had been right in front of me the entire time. George finished putting the groceries away, but he remained close enough that I could smell the subtle scent of his cologne, something sharp and clean that made my stomach knot. You okay? He asked voice. I should have moved first and put space between us, but I didn't. I let the moment stretch and let the air between us grow thick with something unsaid. Low and a little rough around the edges, I forced a smile and asked myself, why wouldn't I be? His eyes briefly dipped to my mouth before flicking back up to make sure I exhaled and reached for the last bag, hoping to relieve the tension, but he beat me to it by grabbing my wrist before I could get away. It wasn't a firm grip, just enough to make my breath catch and give me a sudden, intense thrill that I shouldn't have had. I glanced up at him, looking for any indication that I was dreaming, but there was no hesitation in his expression. I started, but he interrupted me. I think about you, he said in a steady voice, certainly more than I should. I felt as though my breath had been taken out of me, and I knew that he shouldn't have said that because it was improper, because he was my best friend's son, and I wasn't some stupid woman who allowed herself to get caught up in something, careless, but instead of saying anything, I just stood there with his fingers still on my wrist and his body so close. I could sense his warmth. My head was pounding and screaming for me to stop this and back off before it was too late. But when I opened my mouth, it wasn't a protest. It wasn't anything at all. Because before I could say anything, he released my wrist and reached up, brushing my jaw in a way that gave me a sharp thrill. Then, suddenly, the moment was over, and I should leave. His voice became quieter, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod, okay. He lingered for a moment, his eyes still fixed on mine, and then turned and left without saying anything more. My body was still pulsing with something deadly that I knew I shouldn't want, but I did, and I had no clue how I was going to stop myself from wanting more. I let out a trembling breath and gripped the edge of the counter to stabilize myself. I truly tried to forget about it, but as I lay in bed that night, my body was still charged and my skin was still buzzing from George's gaze on me. The son of my best buddy has grown up to be incredibly attractive and broad-shouldered. The following morning, I woke up early because I needed to clear my head of the lingering fog. I busied myself with housework, cleaning the kitchen counters, vacuuming rooms that didn't need it, and anything else to keep my mind occupied. But when my phone buzzed and I saw his name, my stomach tightened. I turned over, staring at the ceiling, frustrated at myself. It was nothing, a little flirtation, a bit of tension, but I knew deep down that I was lying to myself. The knock came 20 minutes later, and when I opened the door, he was standing there with a brown paper bag in one hand and another in his pocket. He appeared casual, as if this was just another visit, but his eyes told a different story. I hesitated for only a moment before responding. Yes, George thought I'd stop by. Got something for you. I stared at the message. It was too early for this for whatever game he was playing, but instead, my fingers moved on their own. He remarked, I brought breakfast. I hope you like bagels. He lifted the bag. I crossed my arms in an attempt to appear calm, but I could sense the undercurrent beneath his smooth, effortless voice. Could I enter? I should have said no. I should have given him an excuse that I was busy. But I stepped aside and let him go. He moved through my kitchen as he had the day before, putting the bag down and taking out the coffee and cream cheese, obviously pausing to pick them up. He was settling into my space once more, and I detested how much I enjoyed it. George, I started, but he interrupted me, saying, Relax, with a smirk. Just breakfast, I exhaled, and he joined me at the table. He smirked as he opened his bagels and spread cream cheese on them. His eyes darted to his hands, then back to his face. He was observing me, saying, You didn't just come here to bring me breakfast. And I swallowed. This isn't a good idea. Why not? I laughed, shaking my head. I never said you were, but you kept staring at me as if you were trying to convince yourself of something, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I stood needing distance, but he was up too, stepping closer before I could react and tell him to stop. He said softly. I opened my mouth ready to say it, but I didn't. And when he reached out, brushing his fingers along my wrist again, I knew I wouldn't. I let the moment stretch too long, letting my silence tell him everything. He held my gaze, his fingers still ghosting over my wrist, waiting for a sign. A part of me wanted to pull away to break this before it got any further. But the larger part, the part I was losing control of, wanted to see how far he would go. George, though I muttered, unsure of what I was going to say. But my voice was different, softer, and less certain. His body was getting closer, and his grip tightened just a little. He smelled of fresh coffee and the clean morning air, and when his fingers touched my elbow, the warmth of his touch made me shudder. He whispered, You don't have to pretend. I should have stopped this. I knew I should have, but I was exhausted from fighting what I had already lost. I barely nodded, and he took it as the answer he had been waiting for. His fingers traced up my arm slowly, testing, savoring when they reached my shoulder. His other hand cued my waist, and my breath caught as he leaned in his lips, whispering away. Then there was a loud knock on the door, which broke the spell between us. He closed his eyes for a moment before moving away, hands sliding into his pockets as if nothing had happened. But I could see in his eyes the same lingering hunger I was desperately trying to hide. I forced myself to swallow, and as I opened the door, my best friend was standing there, grinning, completely unaware of what she had just said. Ed, I thought I'd drop by my stomach while I was in the neighborhood. I dropped off my best friend George's mother, and she entered without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes instantly fell on George, who had moved to the counter to get his coffee as if nothing was amiss. I didn't know you were here, she said, smiling between the two of us. Yeah, George said smoothly. I just stopped by to bring breakfast. Her eyes softened. That's sweet of you, she said, before turning to face me. I made an effort to grin. My heartbeat remained irregular, as usual. She sat down in a chair, totally oblivious to the tempest that was building beneath the surface. George's eyes met mine, and I realized then that this was far from over. While I stood there trying to gather myself, George's mother sat down at the kitchen table, entirely at ease. I could still feel the warmth of George's touch, the ghost of his fingers on my wrist, and my heart was pounding, but I forced a smile to resist the urge to look at him. He, on the other hand, seemed perfectly calm, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. Do you have any plans today? She asked, breaking the silence. I spoke to George the other day about how nice it would be if we all got together soon like in the past. George didn't respond, but I knew he was observing me because my hands felt clammy. I said, keeping my voice light-hearted, that sounds nice, and she smiled. I shook my head. Nothing special, just catching up on things around the house. At last, George said in a calm yet strong tone that it depends on her schedule, Mother. You two act like you don't have time for a simple dinner. It's been forever since we've all been together, his mother said, turning to him with a little laugh. George shrugged. We'll figure something out. I nodded rapidly, desperate to divert the conversation from plans that involved prolonging time around. George, please let me know when she finally dropped it. She was reaching for a bagel from the bag George had brought, totally unaware of the heavy air in the room. I, on the other hand, felt like I was suffocating because George was still too close, and I could feel his heat even across the room. I needed to get out, so I said, well, I should get going. His mother looked surprised, but I insisted on forcing a comforting smile, because it's just small things I need to attend to. George's eyes met mine, as though he could see right through the excuse, but he said nothing. His mother said, standing up, I won't keep you. George remained silent as I walked them to the door, my heart thumping with each step. When his mother left, I thought I was safe, but as he turned to follow her, his hand briefly touched my lower back. It was a slow, deliberate touch that sent a warning and a promise, and then he was gone. I closed the door behind them, leaning against it with a heavy sigh, my skin still tingled where he had touched me. I should have been relieved that they were gone, that the tension had been released, but all I tried to ignore it for the rest of the day. But it didn't help. The image of George's hands and the way he had gazed at me still plagued me like a ghost. All I could think about was that touch, that unspoken message between us. This wasn't over. When my phone finally buzzed and I saw his name on the screen, my resolve broke. George couldn't stop thinking about you today, and I stared at the message with trembling fingers, knowing that if he messaged me, I wouldn't be able to ignore it. That night, as I lay in bed, I vowed I wouldn't let this go any further. Careless, but rather of putting my phone away and stopping this before it got out of control, I ended up typing back to myself, I couldn't. George permitted me to see you almost immediately, and I swallowed hard before typing the words that would change everything. Looking back, I should have told George no and ignored it, but the temptation was too big and the draw was too strong. After sending my address, I heard a car pull up outside, and as I peeked through the curtain to see George step out, his face shadowed in the dim light, I opened the door before he could knock. He stood there for a moment, his eyes searching mine, as if he were giving me one last chance to back out. But I didn't, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The silence was thick with tension, and then without saying anything, he reached for me. The kiss was slow at first, testing, searching, but when I didn't pull away, it deepened, turning into something hungry and desperate, and his hands were firm on my waist, pulling me flush against him. I felt my self-control unraveling, the weight of everything else disappearing. George was not in a hurry and wanted me to experience every moment of this, and I did. "You don't have to be scared," he whispered against my skin as his lips followed my jaw and his hands moved slowly and purposefully. I was afraid, but not of him or of what we were doing. Rather, I was afraid of how much I desired this because I was aware that once I allowed him there would be no going back. George's hands tightened around my waist, his hold possessive as though he thought I could change my mind. But I wasn't leaving. I could feel his body heat pressing against mine, and my breath was coming quickly. I had tried all day to persuade myself that this was untrue and that it couldn't happen. But as soon as he entered my room, every defense I had made was rejected, and his lips moved against my skin in a playful way that made me shudder. "I've wanted this for a very long time," he whispered, his voice husky with desire. I closed my eyes and allowed the weight of his confession to descend upon me. The way he held me, the way he gazed at me. This is hazardous. It wasn't simply attraction. There was something more profound that frightened me, curled slightly at her sides. I turned away, feeling ashamed. It wasn't supposed to happen, but she took a slow, measured breath, and I nodded yes for a long time. She said nothing, which surprised me because I expected anger, betrayal, and pain. But when she did speak, her voice was quieter than I had expected, and she shook her head briefly before laughing hollowly. "You were my best friend," and the past tense went through me like a knife. I stepped forward in desperation to save something, but I never wanted to hurt you. "So, why did you do it?" "I'm not even sure what to say to you." Her voice broke, and it was the first genuine display of emotion I had ever seen in her. I swallowed the knot in my throat. I'm not sure why, it simply occurred. Her arms crossed across her chest and her brows sharpened. "You're older than him and know better." Although I had no defense, the comments hurt, and she was correct. I adore him, and I should have ended it before it even began. She exhaled sharply and shook her head, admitting softly that the words had slipped out before I could stop them. It was the first time I had said it aloud, and it scared me. "You don't know what you're saying. I do." My voice was stronger now. "I've tried to ignore it and fight it, but neither he nor I can." Her expression twisted with something I couldn't quite interpret, and I didn't realize the front door opened abruptly, so I didn't have an answer. "What happens next? Do you believe you two can just be together like this won't wreck everything?" He must have sensed the tension because his eyes darted between us as George entered. He said, "Mom," cautiously, his eyes darting to me. "What's going on?" She let out a sharp breath. "Why don't you tell me?" His jaw tensed, but he didn't back down. "I love you," she said with a bitter laugh. "Of course you think you do." "I do," he insisted, and he didn't care what anyone said. Her eyes flashed with an almost panicked expression. "George, you're young. You don't know what you're doing." He squared his shoulders, and she turned to face me. Her expression was unreadable. "You're really going to do this?" I hesitated, then nodded, and she blinked away the tears that filled her eyes, saying, "I hope it's worth it because I don't think I can ever forgive you for this." The words broke my heart, but I knew there was no turning back. She turned to walk to the kitchen, seemingly unable to bear to look at me any longer. George reached for my hand. His grip was firm and steady, and he let go. Knowing that everything I had created with her was gone, I took one more look back, but as soon as I saw George, I realized that this was my decision. With a sorrowful heart but a hand in his, I went out with him.